I'm Joanna Wedge, and I'm the moderator of this series. I work as the Implementation and Capacity Development Advisor for the Child Protection Minimum Standards Working Group of the Alliance. The aim of this series is for child protection practitioners to improve their ability to build staff and partners' capacity to implement the minimum standards. Today's session examines one of our favorite capacity building techniques, case studies. So we're going to look at developing and using case studies as an effective training tool for CPiE actors. Our discussions will draw from many examples from the recent materials, particularly on CPMS mainstreaming. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Samantha Newman. Samantha has wide-ranging experience of child protection in the humanitarian sector, as well as protection and human rights more broadly. A lawyer and legal instructor, she's the author of the CPMS mainstreaming case studies that I just mentioned. So Samantha, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, particularly your training experiences?
Well, first of all, thanks, Joanna, and thanks to the Alliance for organising this webinar series. It's a really interesting topic. I think all the topics you're looking at are really interesting. And I think case studies is a bit of a neglected topic to discuss and talk about its application in different contexts. So I'm very excited to be talking about it today. And I apologise, this is my first time for doing a webinar, so we've had a few technical issues, but hopefully everything is okay. And I also need to apologise because my PowerPoints lack the ingenuity that trainers should usually do when they're putting together slides. But just to give you a bit of background to my experiences, particularly with case studies, at the moment I'm working as an independent consultant, so I have different clients and different projects that I work on. Most of them are training related or capacity building related. And I also split my time now as a sort of part-time academic fellow at the University of New South Wales Law Faculty, where I teach human rights. So I've been using case studies both as a training methodology and also in workshops, and also in an academic context with university students, as well as obviously writing the CPMS mainstreaming standards. So I've sort of looked at it from a variety of different perspectives and in different contexts. So that's probably enough for me for now.
So I wanted to start off by talking briefly about the CPMS mainstreaming case studies, and to share with you a little bit of what is in that series. As Sam mentioned, we're having a little bit of trouble with our PowerPoints, but hopefully everyone will be able to see what's on my screen, and I'll read it out in case you have any difficulties. So here is the set of case studies that were produced. So the Child Protection Minimum Standards Working Group wanted to zero in on the case studies from number 19 to, sorry, on the minimum standards on mainstreaming, so standards 19 to 26. I wanted to pull out lessons learned and experiences and good practices and so on around mainstreaming of child protection in humanitarian settings. And so developed with Samantha's inputs a series of individualized case studies, as well as some lessons learned, which we'll go over today, as well as also some facilitators notes to help people use these, because there are obviously a variety of ways that one can use the different case studies. So again, this will be something that Samantha will draw upon through her presentation. You can download some samples of the case studies, the CPMS mainstreaming case studies, if you haven't already. They are on the Alliance website for you to look at. And have been nicely laid out and very user-friendly, I would say, as a format. And in addition, I should just also point out that attached to the webinar, there are some handouts, which we can also send afterwards to you. But some of the theoretical materials, as well as the lessons learned that I just mentioned, that Samantha has pulled together. Hopefully that will be a takeaway for you to take after the webinar is over. So Samantha, I just mentioned that as the CPMS working group, we wanted to shine a spotlight on the mainstreaming of child protection and those specific standards. Can you talk us through why case studies were chosen as the method for doing that?
Sure. I think maybe to answer that question, it's helpful to talk a little bit about what case studies are and why they have benefit, and then I'll talk through some of the goals that we had. I'll be able to do something. I mean, I guess the short answer to your question is that from the working group's point of view, there was a general understanding about why protection or child protection mainstreaming was so important, but less understanding of what it actually required, I guess, in terms of the process. And so, you know, I think the sort of information I was getting from the working group was that people often could even point out a couple of little examples, but didn't really understand the sort of the level of involvement, the different stakeholders, you know, the different problems that come up and how they're resolved. And so we decided that that case studies would be the best format to explore some of these different issues in a more engaging way. There are a number of different sort of broader themes and theories to look at when we to try and understand why case studies are such a powerful way of enhancing learning. And the first for me sort of touches on what is known as narrative theory. And at its most basic, narrative theory is essentially basically posits that we are all storytellers as human beings, and that we have a need to tell stories. We also have a need to hear stories in order to sort of make sense of our life, our experiences. So in other words, stories give us meaning, and they also give us sort of a coherent way of understanding experiences, but through those experiences, our own identities. And so in this context, it's sort of I think it's interesting to look at why storytelling is so powerful, both in terms of those who are telling the stories, but also those who are hearing the stories and sort of experiencing it through the other person. And so I think that's one reason why case studies resonate so powerfully, particularly if they're done well. But the second aspect to look at is to sort of zoom out again and look at the theories around how adults learn best. And Malcolm Knowles, who was sort of the father of adult learning in a way, basically came up with these 4 principles that in terms of understanding how adults learn. And so what he argued was that first, adults learn best if they know why they're learning something. So I always say in a training, it's essential sort of, you know, in the first session of the workshop to really ground participants in an understanding of exactly why they've given up their time to come and learn something new. So it's really important that they understand why they're learning something. Second, that they learn best if they learn through experience. And experience in training can happen through a variety of ways. You know, often it's through activities, but it can also be through case studies as well, because you're sort of experiencing it with the person who the story is about. Third is that adults tend to learn best if they're able to view, or they tend to view learning as an opportunity to solve problems. So again, it's critical that they can see the sort of practical aspects, they can see the challenges and the solutions. And I think that's really important in our context, because I think in the humanitarian context more broadly, we have I think there's this sort of seems to be a new resistance towards using the language of problems as though there's something inherently negative in that term. But for our brains, understanding things in terms of problems and processes and decision making to get to solutions is really important. It helps us make sense of things. And the last point about how adults learn best is when the topic is relevant to them and is immediately applicable. So if you look just through that list alone, you can see fairly quickly that that in fact, you know, case studies sort of tick all those boxes in different ways. And so already they're kind of a natural methodology that makes sense to adults. It's easy for them to kind of engage with it. And then the third element that I think links to, you know, is important to consider in terms of thinking about how case studies work and what their benefit is to think about it in terms of learning domains. And again, this is a theorist for adult learning, Benjamin Bloom, who developed sort of 3 main learning domains that we think about when we're developing trainings or workshops, any sort of capacity building. And we sort of, under this theory anyway, we should think of training in terms of what kind of knowledge do we want to sort of share with participants, what kind of skills do we want them to be able to practice, in other words, what do we want them to be able to do, and third, what kind of attitudes do we want to see them express or, you know, sort of develop through a capacity building activity, because those attitudes will influence behaviour. And we know with child protection mainstreaming in particular, there's a lot that rides on that attitude component, because we can often come across a lot of resistance to even sort of the language of child protection mainstreaming. And I think a lot of sectors still have some fear and concerns and all sorts of feelings about this sort of thing, and it's not always the most sort of politically neutral activity. So being aware of those things is really important. And again, a case study, if it's done well, can sort of elaborate on all of those three different domains if it's facilitated properly. So I think we'll go to the next slide, if that's okay, Joanna.
Yeah, we're on benefits to using case studies.
Yep, great. Okay, so again, thinking about why case studies are particularly helpful. First of all, they're practical and they're concrete. They're based on real life experiences. If they can be fictional, but they should be nevertheless based on what's realistically likely. So already with that concrete and practical nature of case studies, people are already going to be interested and engaged. Second, case studies are about focusing and honing in on problem solving and critical analysis skills. So particularly if we look at the sort of most elaborate, I guess, context, which would be, you know, something that's done in a university context where they often have like very, you know, kind of detailed case studies that, and in fact some schools, including business schools, you know, pretty much only use case studies as their primary way of teaching students. So you can emphasize or de-emphasize the degree to which a case study requires problem solving and critical analysis skills. But in its most traditional way, that's the premise of a case study, is that it has a range of different problems embedded in it, and requires the reader or the participant to really think critically about what they would do in that scenario. And then the third element in general of why case studies are particularly beneficial is, of course, that because they're often personal, because they're taking the point of view of a particular individual or group of individuals, it's inherently relatable, and encourages seeing things from a different point of view, and is a sort of personal connection. And this sort of comes back to that narrative theory that we were talking about. Now, in terms of why it's particularly helpful, I think, for CPiE mainstreaming, and this is why I was so excited when the working group sort of came up with this approach. I mean, I mentioned earlier that there was an impression that people understood why child protection mainstreaming was important, but didn't really understand how it was done. And again, case studies allowed us the scope to really get into the nitty-gritty of the different decision-making processes that people went through, and some of the challenges they faced in a really personal way. So it gave so much meat, I guess, to the bones of how this would be done. And if you would compare, say, using a case study to doing a PowerPoint on how to do CPiE mainstreaming, you can see immediately that it's a much more distant and more abstract concept when you're trying to deliver it in that way. The second thing is that, you know, I think we made a decision that we were largely going to focus on talking to non-child protection professionals and actors, because we really wanted their perspective to be sort of at the basis, I guess, of these case studies, to make sure that it was relatable not only for child protection actors, but particularly for those who are not part of child protection and who are being asked to increasingly do this type of work, so that, again, they can identify with the different, I guess, characters in these stories. And then the third aspect is something that's sort of just my own reflections on why case studies are so useful, particularly for child protection mainstreaming. One of the things that we talk about in terms of sort of a loosely described skill set for child protection mainstreaming is having a child protection lens. And that lens enables the person to look at different contexts and activities and see it from a different point of view and start seeing the different child protection issues that can come up. For me, what that requires of an individual is to have an ability to empathize, to sort of see things from the perspective of a child or a family, and to start seeing the different issues that are coming up. And that empathy, I think, once it's triggered, kind of really becomes then a skill that people can use to change the way they see things. And a case study seems to be a particularly powerful vehicle to evoke feelings of empathy. I can think of two experiences that I've had using this. One was during a training that was on sort of more broadly on protection mainstreaming, and it was after a simulation that didn't quite go as we'd planned. The participants didn't quite get there in terms of what they needed to do. And we realized that there was this sort of mental sort of block that people had about this issue. So I decided to tell a story to the participants, and I told it from a first-person narrative and from the perspective of somebody who had a female who had survived a natural disaster and was going on this journey. And I don't know what it was about talking in first person and sort of telling this story and these experiences, but it lifted that block in the participants' minds, and they were immediately able to complete the work that we'd wanted them to do. So just the penny dropped somehow, and it was, I believe, through telling that story. A second example I have was communicated to me by one of the people I interviewed for the case studies, and she was a WASH coordinator in Myanmar, and she said she attended a GBV training, and she said she'd been through many of them and had heard them many times, but again, just didn't quite get something. I think she was feeling like she still didn't really understand how to see things from a particular female's point of view. And that was limiting her ability to, I guess, to creatively problem solve as things came up. And she said this trainer got up and again told a story from, it was a case study, but it was told as a story. And again had the same experience. It shifted her perspective markedly, and she really sort of felt, she said she felt humbled and she felt ashamed in a way about some of the decisions she'd made, but she fully kind of emotionally connected with the issues that at play. And I think that's something that we don't maybe focus on as much, but I think it's something worth considering and remembering, because it's crucial to effective mainstreaming of child protection. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of how to decide what kind of case studies you want, you need to first understand why you're using them and what you want people to get out of them. And that will really, because there are so many different ways to do case studies, it's important to be really clear about what the goals are and what the learning outcomes are. And indeed, if a case study is even the right vehicle for those. And so, for us with the mainstreaming case studies, we had a number of different goals. So this is why it was a little difficult to sort of figure out a way to address all of them. And in a way, it was helpful having so many case studies, because it meant that different case studies could sort of tick different goals in a way. First, obviously, we wanted to structure it around the minimum standards. We weren't able to get all of them completed, but we certainly got most of them done. And so it was, as I said before, partly to give people different ideas of how to mainstream child protection and give them a really solid understanding of the process. I also think with child protection in emergencies and with mainstreaming, a really important skill is decision making. I think in the context of humanitarian emergencies, decision making is both crucial and often can be very challenging, particularly if there are people who are uncomfortable making decisions without having all the information at hand. which we often don't have in humanitarian emergencies. So I think case studies, again, can really help to improve decision-making skills, especially if they're structured in the right way to sort of challenge people on that. I've talked again about enhancing people's ability to have a child protection lens. And then the other thing that we were talking about was, you know, is this for people in the field, or is this people who have not been to the field yet and may want to, may want to learn a bit more about things before they go to the field? Another key question we were asking ourselves is, was this for child protection actors or for non-child protection actors? And we tried to sort of have it for everyone in a way. And particularly on the question of whether it was, you know, most useful for people in the field or people who are training to sort of join the humanitarian effort or the child protection field, we decided that the facilitators sort of would need to really sort of consider how much information is necessary for people to have before they engage with the case studies fully, in terms of sort of background information. And I personally feel like it's you know, both relevant for child protection and non-child protection actors as well. Okay, so let me just quickly go through the process. Okay, so first I mentioned you need to determine what your goals are. Are they, for example, to look at particular so, for example, if they are to look at particular knowledge components, so you want people to understand things better, then it's less important to, you know, to sort of make the problem-solving aspect. Sorry, let me just start again. If you want to have just knowledge, and so part of when we were writing the case studies was that we really wanted people to know about the process. That meant that we wrote the full case study out, which included different problems that came up along the way and how they were resolved and so on to come to a solution. If you were, for example, wanting to encourage more decision making and sort of critical thinking skills, then you might just start with the sort of context and come up with the initial problem. And then pause, you know, for a discussion about how to resolve those problems, and then you could resume the story. So it just, again, depends on what it is that you want to get out of it. But for in general, for developing the case studies, you have to know what it is that you want to communicate. So in a way, you're starting with the end result and working your way back. You start with what your learning outcomes are, and therefore what are the main themes that you need to explore, and so on. And then you go through writing your interview questions. So we sat down and worked out overall what we wanted each case study to sort of touch on in terms of key themes. We started to develop a list of what I described as sort of elements for good child protection in emergencies mainstreaming, and what were some of the sort of key principles that we thought, what were some of the key standards, you know, and so on, to develop this sort of fairly detailed list of roughly how we wanted to approach each interview. And then you have to conduct the interview. So this is where it gets tricky. Again, in order for a case study to be really good, it needs to be engaging, it needs to be interesting and human. So so the way I conducted the interviews was to just, I had my sort of outline of questions that I wanted to ask, but, you know, things don't ever go in a linear way. And in fact, you don't, when you're interviewing someone, want it to necessarily go in a linear way. You want them to sort of talk about as much as they want to talk about, because it's often those little, I guess, tributaries off the story that become really interesting. And so you have to sort of be listening very carefully to what people are saying. I recorded all my interviews so I could go back and write up my notes later. I just wanted to really listen. And you just talk to them about the different processes they went through. Again, this is sort of when the interview subject, it's really important that there's somebody who has a little bit of analysis skills. I mean, you can do quite a lot of the work yourself as an interviewer if you're asking the right questions, but it helps, you know, the better stories are the ones with people who have a bit of self-awareness and ability to kind of, I guess, pull back from the story and start to see some of the themes themselves and start to talk about the different decision-making processes. It also really helps, and I think is really important, given that case studies are for a training methodology are best if they're sort of problem-based, that you make sure you're not interviewing somebody who thinks that everything that they did was perfect and isn't prepared to dwell on any of the challenges they faced or any difficult decisions. And that can be quite hard when people know that their stories are going to be published in some way. But I think it's essential that case studies have enough grit to them that they have people struggling with different aspects, and that there's learning that comes from that. If it's just a story about how great things are, I think that's very helpful for donor reports and to promote different aspects and to highlight and provide illustrations of different things, but it's not so great from a training point of view. So then you need to think again about structuring your case study, and this is where your questions become important. You start to pull out the main themes, and you want to tell a story that makes sense in terms of the time frame and sort of a step-by-step approach to some extent. And then, of course, you have to write the case study. So I was talking with Joanna about this and about some of the challenges that we had about how to best write the case study. I had been really inspired by a book that was written by Joe Becker, who published a book that was a series of case studies about human rights advocacy. And Joe Becker's a child rights professional, works or had used to work with Human Rights Watch as an advocate. So what I loved about her book was that she wrote in this incredibly informative yet conversational way. And it was light and interesting, and you really got into the story, and you were sort of almost gripped by the decisions and the different things that happened along the way. So I tried to emulate that to the extent possible. And I think one of the challenges in our sector is that people have different writing preferences and different writing styles, and so we did have a little bit of, I think we had to compromise a little bit. I wanted it to be much more conversational, much more story-like. And then others in the group wanted it to be a little bit more formal and a little bit more, I guess, more common in terms of the types of work that we see in our sector being produced. So we found, I think, I hope, a happy medium anyway. So I guess to sum up, what makes a good case study, it should be a story at the end of the day. It needs to be some kind of engaging story based on real life. Again, if it's fictional, it needs to have it has to be realistic. It helps if you research the area and have a bit of a background understanding. I've mentioned engaging style. It should present problems and challenges, and then also try to present a solution or conclusion if needed. So it depends on whether you decide to kind of leave the solution out of the story or not. But inevitably, if you're basing a case study on real life, everybody in the room is going to want to know what happened at the end of it. So at least have it in mind. Okay, so should we pause for some questions?
That sounds good. That's the first part of Samantha's presentation, which really looks at why case studies and how to develop them. Then we're going to look into afterwards a little bit more about different ways you can use them, particularly in a training setting. So those are the two components. So this is a chance for questions. If you want to put up your hand and I can unmute your mic, or if you want to put a question into the question box, either way would work. And maybe while we wait for questions, Sam, I could ask you something directly. Because around in the package, you also looked at or created a facilitator's note, a guide kind of for facilitators. Can you talk a little bit about why you didn't think the case studies would just stand on their own, but why they needed that additional piece?
Yes. I think that part of it was a recognition that although we hoped that the case studies could be used for all sorts of different uses, we recognise that they would hopefully also be used a lot in training and workshop sort of contexts, or as a precursor to some kind of group planning exercise or something of the kind. So we had a lot of discussion about the facilitators' notes and how best to do it. And I'll be honest and say, I think one of the things that had we had more time, I think would have been great, is if we'd been able to provide facilitators notes for each case study, because they were quite different and they had different lessons learned and highlighted different issues. So you know, and were kind of written in a way, when I was writing them anyway, I sort of had my facilitator's hat kind of half on. So I was already thinking about, you know, here would be a great point to pause and have a group activity and brainstorm about some possible solutions to this, or here would be great to, you know, have people talk about their own experiences in relation to this or whatever. But they're all quite specific to the case study. So what we did was, you know, sort of as a compromise, given the time and resource constraints that we had, was to sort of think, okay, well, what are some main themes that we see throughout the case study? So I went through and sort of highlighted for me what were the main lessons learned, sort of viewed cumulatively, I guess. And then the other thing that we wanted to look at was sort of what basic guidance could we provide for facilitators so that they have at least a starting point for thinking about how they might want to use this in a training context.
Great. If people haven't had a chance to look at it, it's really an interesting guide. So I encourage you to download that and take a look in order to support the use of these particular case studies, or even as a prototype for something else you might be developing. Okay, doke. I don't see any questions, so Sam, why don't we move on to the next part of the presentation around using them.
Okay, so yeah, that's the slide. How can you use case studies?
Yeah.
So this is for sure not in any way an exhaustive list. I was just trying to think of different ways that you could use them that were maybe a little different from the standard way. I mean, the first thing we thought about was that the case studies should be a self-learning tool. You know, that you should be able to read the stories and kind of understand what was going on and the different decisions that were happening, and then and hopefully be able to pull out the lessons learned just from the text itself. But it does require a little bit of work. So as a facilitator, it's something that you would want to do is to make sure you go through the story, read it several times, and really pull out the lessons learned as you see them. So distance learning is certainly one way to do it. And I guess if you were going to do it as a distance learning tool, you would need to sort of put together some sort of guide to help people get more learning out of it. So some form of a facilitator's guide, you know, that's sort of almost like a comprehension guide to see what sort of things that they took from the case study. You could do it in a workshop either by getting people to read the case study first and then come to the workshop, or you can you know, just sort of have people read it during the workshop itself. I kind of like the idea, if it were me doing it, I would sort of maybe experiment a little bit and maybe just try this sort of problem-solving approach and see if you could pull out the beginning part of the case study to sort of introduce people to the concepts, and then give them a particular problem that needs to be solved and sort of do it in a staggered way. One of my colleagues from the working group was talking about how she would probably use it as a precursor to a planning exercise if you were sort of doing some sort of strategic planning around CP mainstreaming. So for CP actors, it could certainly help to sort of prompt some ideas and maybe facilitate some interesting discussion. It could also be a precursor to some sort of activity that's testing skills that may be identified in the case study. So you know, perhaps if it's you know, you're working with people who are using some form of space, child-friendly space of some kind, you could maybe get them to read the Makani case study as sort of an example of that, and then maybe practice some different skills that are raised in the case study. And we've also talked about its ability to be used as some kind of soft advocacy, as you know, examples that you can share with donors and so on. It's I think it's a useful because it gives details about what CP mainstreaming looks like in the field, and gives a variety of different examples. So next slide. So that raises the question of what is the role of the facilitator. And it's an interesting role in this sort of environment. I read something somewhere, it was a quote by a professor, I think, who said that when it comes to case studies, the facilitator has to practice the art of managing uncertainty. And I think that's really true, because in case studies, the best facilitators are ones that kind of that don't mind the fact that this isn't a sort of direct line. When you're teaching a case study, you're pulling out all sorts of things, and discussions can go in a variety of different directions, and to some extent you have to be comfortable with that uncertainty. You're also asking the participants to be uncomfortable, to be comfortable with that level of uncertainty, because that's sort of what the case study requires of them in terms of making decisions and so on. So in terms of skills, it's really important, again, so not just to read the case study a number of times and pull out the lessons learned, but really think about where you're going to ask questions and how you're going to ask them and at what point. And really thinking about how to phrase the question so that you can get the right answers. So in some way, it can be quite a structured way to do things. I prefer to be structured and pointed in terms of how I ask questions and at what point, and what I'm trying to get out of it in terms of a response. But I try not to ask too many of them, so I can allow the discussion to evolve if it needs to. You need to be, of course, because this is all discussion based, you have to be comfortable with managing and coordinating discussions, and that can be really challenging. I think that's probably the biggest challenge with facilitating case studies. You're not quite sure where the discussion is always going to go. You want to encourage, everyone to participate in some way, and you also want to avoid conversations going off the rails a little bit, which can happen as well. So it just requires being comfortable with seeing where the discussion is going, knowing where you want it to go, and trying to sort of subtly guide people there. And then the last skill that I think is really important for a facilitator is that you want to be able to draw on the lessons learned in the case study, and then to some extent you want to be able to universalize them. In other words, you want to be able to sort of pull back and start talking about the main themes and how they apply to bigger issues that you're facing, so that the case study doesn't just become something that's useful for answering how you do food distribution in a child-friendly way, but rather is a broader discussion about how you engage with different stakeholders, how you work with communities on different issues, and so on.
Before you go further, I'm going to pop up the poll and have people tell us how often they've used a written child protection case study in the last 6 months as a trainer. And you go on speaking, and we'll just get people to answer that poll while you're speaking.
Okay. So the last point, I guess, on this slide was that I just wanted to mention, as I said, that the facilitator's guide is quite generic. It's not meant to be specific to any particular case study. So it's really important that if you're facilitating them, that you find some way to make them your own. Either by, as I've talked about, revealing the story in stages, or identifying specific lessons learned, embedding questions in different parts, taking parts out, maybe changing the ending in different ways. There are many different ways that you could do it. I'd be quite interested to hear from those who have used the case studies, how they've adapted them, if they've adapted them to their own needs.
Well, people are using case studies, that's clear. 67% of you have used one in the last few months, but it'll be great, as Sam said, to hear back from you as you use them over the coming months, of the ways that you adapted them, or challenges you had, or ways that you integrated them maybe with some other materials and so on. Go ahead, Sam.
No, I think that was pretty much it for me. I think that what I'd be interested now is sort of hearing a bit more from you guys about some of the challenges you faced, or some of the different uses you found for different case studies, or case studies more broadly, not just the mainstreaming ones.
Great. So again, if you'd like to maybe share one of your experiences, or maybe share some resources that you've used, we'd love to hear it by you raising your hand, and we'll activate your microphone, or by putting something into the question/chat box. Sam, while we wait, could you tell us a little bit more about the resources you've shared in the handouts?
Right. So, I mean, these were just some basic documents that I find really useful. Sorry, unfortunately, because my computer has frozen.
So fortunately, we still have your audio. We have the lessons learned, and then we have case study based learning.
Yeah, I mean, One of the things I think that I learnt through going through this process of interviewing and talking with people about their different experiences on mainstreaming was also trying to and trying to convey some of the challenges I think that non-child protection actors have with the concept and also the process of working with child protection actors on mainstreaming issues. And we tried to convey those in the case studies in the most useful way possible, I think. So we certainly didn't want it to come across as you know, as being critical of how things are currently being done. But there was some feedback from a number of people that I spoke to that you know, that they struggled, that often they felt like you know, child protection actors didn't fully understand their sector or how they do things or their workloads, and I think that the main message that I got from a number of people I spoke to was that that non-child protection actors were often looking to child protection actors for concrete guidance, you know, for answers to really sort of urgent problems that they were having along the way, and that wasn't always the easiest thing to get. So that's not, you know, that was just one, I guess, element that I thought was really interesting, and hopefully that the case studies can kind of help build child protection actors' skills as well, on, you know, in order for them to have a better ability to kind of give technical support and advice, because it was that sort of ongoing, those sort of daily, regular relationships that were built that seemed to be one of the lessons learned that really helped foster a better understanding on both sides of where they were coming from and how they did things. So I guess that was the one lesson learned that I took from the case studies, was that, you know, collaborating more closely, getting to know people better, spending time with them really helped to see opportunities where they could engage with in mainstreaming activities that they may not have ever thought of.
Great, thank you. Not seeing any specific questions or hands raised. I do see, just had a little chat with Hedaya about how we're using a lot of case studies when we do case management training. You talked about you know, general CP training and engaging with other sectors. You talked about your law background and how it can be used there and in business school, but also case studies are obviously something we use extensively when we do our case management training, and in that package there's quite a number of case studies articulated there.
You know, I think they're ideal for any sort of work that requires, like I said, you know, sort of problem solving and really kind of thinking complexly about different issues and different elements. So yeah, case management would be perfect because that's a lot to do with process as well. There's just one last thing that I wanted to say that I forgot to say earlier, and that was just about the role of the facilitator. I think, you know, for facilitators to make the most of this kind of methodology, it's helpful to think of the facilitator as serving at quite a large number of different roles, and they may not be the roles that we would normally have in a training context, but you know, so, and they're also a bit contradictory. On the one hand, you need to be the planner because you're obviously organising things and structuring things. You need to be the moderator of the discussions. But sometimes it's helpful to be also the devil's advocate. I certainly do that a lot when I'm teaching case studies because it really pushes participants to start thinking about things differently or to think more deeply about stuff. You need to, in some respects, be a fellow participant kind of on the journey. You don't, you know, want to be seen as, you know, being the film director, but rather another actor, I guess, for want of a better metaphor. And lastly, you also need to be the judge at some point, you know, in certain stages as the facilitator, you need to be able to guide people as to kind of what the best solution is or what the best outcome is. So it's quite hard to balance all those different roles in the same moment, but I think the best facilitators are able to do that fairly convincingly.
Super. I think think it's a technique that we learn. So, you know, obviously it comes easier to some of us than others, but practice both kind of before your mirror or before a
Yeah,
few
for sure.
good colleagues, and then practice when you're actually engaging with training in a group, or even if it's around coaching, just, you know, one or two people and helping them work through that more intimately, you know, one-on-two or one-on-one.
Yeah, I can think of many times. I mean, particularly asking questions is a real skill that does require a lot of practice. And I know many times I've asked questions that just land like a thud in the middle of the room. No one looks at it. No one wants to deal with it. So, yeah, it definitely helps to practice and practice and practice.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your learning and all that practicing, both in terms of the role as facilitator, how to use case studies that, you know, are on your desk, but also I think as well on how to generate them, because as we saw, many people have that experience. Even in the last 6 months, it is something that we draw upon quite extensively in child protection. So we need to create them ourselves to make sure that they're really showing the realities and the challenges of working to protect children in humanitarian settings. So thank you very much, Samantha, for all that practicing and then being willing to share it with us in this forum.
You're very welcome. The last thing I want to say is it was such an exciting process to be part of it, to really get to know and talk with people who are doing some really innovative things. I mean, that was the other main factor that we sort of looked at, is that we wanted to highlight some really amazing projects and different approaches that people are taking. And so I would just encourage people, if they are thinking of writing case studies as well, to really sort of take the time to find the right ones and the ones that really give you the most I guess, learning that you can get out of a story. But thanks, Joanna, and thanks for organising this.
You're very welcome. Our pleasure. So our time will come to an end. We'll wrap up. On behalf of the Child Protection Minimum Standards Working Group and the wider Alliance, thank you, Samantha, for your time and insight. Also, a big thanks to Jed Gerlach of Plan International for helping with the logistics behind the scenes. And that's it. We thank you for your time and attention. We wish you all the best. And as I say, we hope to see you again on another webinar.